In episode 92, titled Social Engineering, Why Network Controls Still Matter Afterward, we treat social engineering as the reality that humans can bypass technical barriers, which means the real test of your architecture is what happens after a click. The exam framing usually assumes that some percentage of users will eventually be tricked, because attackers invest heavily in manipulating people rather than breaking hardened systems directly. When that assumption is accepted, security design shifts from hoping for perfect prevention to engineering containment, visibility, and rapid response. Network controls still matter afterward because compromise is rarely the final act. It is the opening move that tries to pivot from one endpoint into broader access. If you design with that in mind, a successful phish becomes a contained incident instead of an organization-wide breach. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Common social engineering tactics are effective because they target human decision-making under time pressure, uncertainty, and authority, which are conditions that exist in every workplace. Phishing is the broad category where attackers use messages that look legitimate to trick users into clicking links, opening attachments, or entering credentials. Pretexting is more targeted, where the attacker builds a believable story and identity, such as pretending to be a vendor, an executive, or a support technician, and then uses that story to request access or actions. Urgent request manipulation leverages emotion, like fear of missing a deadline or breaking a business process, to push the user into skipping verification steps. These tactics work because they are low cost for attackers and because they can be personalized using publicly available information, making them feel familiar and trustworthy. The exam expects you to recognize that social engineering is a control plane attack against human judgment, which is why technical controls must anticipate it rather than dismiss it. Assuming some users will click is not pessimism. It is realistic threat modeling, and it leads directly to designing for containment and limiting blast radius. Containment begins with limiting what a compromised user account and a compromised endpoint can reach, because the attacker's next step is usually to move laterally or escalate privileges. This is where least privilege, network segmentation, and strong identity controls matter, because they determine whether the attacker can pivot from a single user to sensitive systems. Designing for containment also includes restricting outbound paths, because many malicious payloads need to beacon externally to receive commands or to exfiltrate data. If you plan for containment, you are effectively deciding that the first failure will not become the last failure, because you are building layers that stop the chain from continuing. The exam often rewards this mindset because it aligns with real-world incident patterns where prevention fails but containment succeeds. Segmentation reduces blast radius after compromise by limiting the pathways an attacker can use to move from an initial foothold to higher-value targets. When a user workstation is on a flat network, compromise can lead to scanning, credential harvesting, and direct access attempts against servers and infrastructure that were never intended to be reachable from a user segment. When segmentation is in place, the attacker's movement is constrained to the minimum required paths, forcing them to cross controlled boundaries where monitoring and access policies can detect and block them. Segmentation also helps incident response because it narrows where you need to look for lateral movement, and it makes containment actions less disruptive to unaffected services. In hybrid networks, segmentation includes both on-premises network zones and cloud network constructs, And consistency across these boundaries matters because attackers move across environments. The exam framing tends to treat segmentation as a foundational control because it turns compromise into a localized event rather than a platform-wide threat. Email and web filtering add friction that blocks common lures, and friction is valuable because many attacks rely on volume and speed rather than on perfect stealth. Email filtering can reduce phishing success by blocking known malicious senders, detecting suspicious attachments, and rewriting or isolating links so users do not directly open risky destinations. Web filtering can prevent access to known malicious domains, detect command and control patterns, and block downloads that match malware indicators. These controls are not perfect, but they reduce the number of malicious interactions that reach the user, which lowers the overall success rate for attackers. They also buy time because they can block the most common commodity campaigns, allowing security teams to focus on the more targeted attempts that bypass generic protections. The exam typically expects you to understand that filtering is a prevention layer that supports the broader containment plan, not a standalone solution. Monitoring for impossible travel and abnormal access behavior is how you detect that a social engineering event has transitioned into account misuse, which is often the most damaging outcome. Impossible travel refers to logins that occur from distant locations in timeframes that are not physically plausible, which suggests stolen credentials being used from a different geography. Abnormal access behavior includes unusual time-of-day access, sudden access to systems the user does not normally touch, and changes in authentication patterns such as repeated failures followed by success from new sources. These signals are especially important in hybrid environments because attackers may use compromised credentials to access cloud portals, remote access gateways, and internal services in quick succession, creating a pattern that stands out against baseline behavior. The exam tends to focus on these cues because they translate social engineering into observable telemetry that can trigger response actions. When monitoring is tuned to identity and access anomalies, you can detect compromise even when the initial phishing email is no longer visible. Consider a scenario where a user runs a malicious attachment and the endpoint begins beaconing, which is the common pattern where the payload tries to call out to an external controller for instructions. The user may believe they opened an invoice or a document, but the attachment launches code that establishes persistence and initiates outbound connections at regular intervals. If egress controls are permissive, the beacon succeeds, and the attacker can begin issuing commands, harvesting local credentials, and scanning for reachable internal targets. If egress controls are restrictive and traffic must pass through monitored choke points, the beacon may be blocked or at least logged, giving responders an early signal. The attacker's next move is often to pivot toward privileged accounts or shared resources, so the network paths available from that endpoint determine whether the incident stays small or grows quickly. This scenario illustrates why network controls matter after the click, because they shape what the payload can do next and how quickly you can see it. A pitfall is trusting the internal network too much after compromise, because that trust often assumes that internal equals safe, which is not true once an attacker is inside. Flat internal access models allow compromised endpoints to probe services freely, which makes lateral movement easy and turns malware into a network-wide threat. Trusting internal networks also leads to weak monitoring, where defenders focus only on the perimeter and ignore internal east-west traffic patterns that reveal scanning, credential misuse, and unauthorized service access. In hybrid environments, excessive internal trust can extend into cloud connectivity, where a compromised on-premises endpoint can reach cloud resources through VPN or private links, expanding blast radius across environments. The exam expects you to recognize that internal trust must be earned through segmentation, identity controls, and monitoring, not assumed by topology. When internal trust is reduced appropriately, attackers lose the freedom they rely on after a successful social engineering event. Another pitfall is ignoring training and clear reporting channels, because even with strong technical controls, early reporting can be the difference between containment and escalation. Training matters when it is practical and frequent enough to build recognition of common lures and to reinforce the idea that reporting quickly is valued, not punished. Clear reporting channels matter because users under stress will not hunt for the right mailbox or portal, so reporting must be easy and obvious if you want timely signals. When reporting is slow, attackers gain time to move laterally, establish persistence, and abuse accounts, which increases impact and makes remediation more disruptive. Training also supports technical controls by reducing risky behaviors like enabling macros, entering credentials into unexpected prompts, or ignoring certificate warnings, which lowers success rates for the easiest attacks. The exam tends to treat people and process as part of defense in depth, where human reporting complements monitoring and containment. Quick wins often center on limiting privileges, isolating endpoints, and monitoring lateral movement, because these measures directly reduce the attacker's ability to turn a single compromise into a broader incident. Limiting privileges means users do not have administrative rights by default and do not have access to systems they do not need, which reduces what a compromised account can do. Isolating endpoints can include placing user devices in restricted segments, applying application control, and ensuring outbound access is mediated, which reduces the chance that malware can communicate freely. Monitoring lateral movement focuses on detecting internal scanning, unusual authentication attempts, and new connections between segments that normally do not communicate, because those are classic indicators of post-compromise activity. These quick wins also improve response because they create clearer signals and narrower paths to investigate. The exam often rewards the idea that containment is a design property, where limiting privilege and controlling network movement are the levers that make compromise survivable. Operationally, practicing reporting and response drills regularly is what makes the human and technical layers work together under real conditions. Drills reinforce that reporting is expected and that responders will act quickly, which encourages users to report without fear of blame. Response practice also tests whether containment steps are well understood, such as isolating an endpoint, resetting credentials, invalidating sessions, and checking for lateral movement indicators. Regular drills reveal gaps in communication paths, permissions, and tooling assumptions, which can be fixed before an incident forces the lesson. In hybrid environments, drills should include both on-premises and cloud response actions, because attackers often move across that boundary using the same compromised identity. The exam framing tends to value operational readiness because it shows security is not only controls, but also the ability to execute under pressure. A memory anchor that fits this episode is people tricked, contain fast, verify behavior, because it captures the progression from initial compromise to defensive response. People tricked acknowledges the realistic assumption that some social engineering will succeed, which prevents denial and encourages preparation. Contain fast emphasizes limiting blast radius through segmentation, least privilege, endpoint isolation, and egress controls, because speed matters when an attacker is trying to pivot. Verify behavior focuses on monitoring identity signals, impossible travel, abnormal access, and lateral movement patterns, because that is how you confirm compromise and detect expansion attempts. This anchor helps you remember that prevention is not the only goal, and that post-click defenses are the core of resilience. When you apply it, you naturally connect user behavior, network architecture, and monitoring into a cohesive defensive strategy. A useful exercise is to map controls that limit impact after phishing, because it trains you to think from the assumption of compromise rather than from the hope of prevention. You can start with identity controls like multi-factor authentication and conditional access that prevent stolen credentials from being reused successfully, especially for remote access and cloud portals. You then add segmentation and least privilege to constrain what a compromised user and device can reach, which reduces lateral movement opportunities. Egress controls and web filtering help block beacons and limit data exfiltration paths, which buys time for detection and response. Monitoring for abnormal access behavior and internal movement provides the signals that confirm whether the compromise is expanding, which guides containment actions. The exam expects you to connect these layers logically, showing that after the click, network and identity controls determine how far the attacker can go. Episode 92 concludes with a containment mindset. Accept that social engineering can bypass individual technical barriers, then build the network and identity architecture so that compromise does not automatically become catastrophe. Segmentation reduces blast radius, email and web filtering add valuable friction, and monitoring for impossible travel and abnormal access behavior exposes account misuse and post-compromise movement. Avoiding excessive internal trust and investing in training with clear reporting channels ensures that both technical and human defenses activate quickly. The rehearsal assignment is a scenario walk, where you narrate what happens after a user runs a malicious attachment, which controls slow the attacker, which signals reveal the beacon and lateral movement, and which containment steps limit impact. When you can narrate that chain clearly, you demonstrate the exam-level skill of translating social engineering risk into practical, layered defenses that still matter after the initial mistake. With that approach, social engineering becomes a managed risk rather than an unpredictable disaster. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.